In the chaos of war, where survival is uncertain and emotions are a dangerous luxury, two young soldiers find solace in each other. In the trenches of a brutal battlefield, Ethan and Caleb's forbidden bond grows, a fragile thread of love amid the devastation. But in a world where love is a secret weapon and death is always one step ahead, their story is destined to break hearts. Who will survive when love and war collide? Prepare to uncover the untold story of love that defied the odds and the heartbreak that followed. The sun was setting over the war-torn landscape, casting an eerie glow on the barren fields. Ethan Blake crouched low in the muddy trench, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his heart pounding against his chest. At 24, he had imagined himself anywhere but here: college, a steady job, maybe a normal life. Instead, he was surrounded by the stench of gunpowder and the haunting screams of the injured. He glanced up as the newest recruit arrived, his face streaked with dirt but his blonde hair unmistakably bright under the fading sunlight. "Ethan Blake." The young man's voice was steady, despite the chaos around them. "I'm Caleb Montgomery, assigned to your unit." Ethan gave a quick nod, his eyes scanning Caleb's face. His sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes betrayed a youthful innocence that hadn't yet been hardened by war. Ethan tried to keep his expression neutral, but something about Caleb intrigued him. "You're late, Montgomery," Ethan muttered, trying to mask the sudden warmth creeping into his tone. "Stick close, and don't get yourself killed." For the rest of the evening, Caleb shadowed Ethan, proving to be more competent than Ethan had expected. He followed orders without hesitation, his movements precise but cautious. There was something about Caleb's determination that struck Ethan, a quiet resilience that reminded him of why he had enlisted in the first place. Later that night, as the unit huddled in the trenches for a brief moment of rest, Caleb sat beside Ethan. The two men exchanged a few words about their hometowns, their families, and the lives they'd left behind. Caleb's laughter was soft and genuine, a stark contrast to the grim reality surrounding them. "You know," Caleb said, leaning back against the cold, damp wall of the trench, "I never thought I'd end up here. Guess life doesn't always go as planned." Ethan turned to him, their eyes meeting in the dim light. "Yeah, but maybe that's not such a bad thing," he replied, his voice softer than he intended. For the first time in months, Ethan felt a glimmer of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't hope exactly. It was more fragile, more dangerous. As their comrades drifted into uneasy sleep, Ethan and Caleb stayed up, their quiet conversation carrying them through the night. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was the beginning of something that would change them forever. Amid the violence and despair, a spark had been lit, and neither man could ignore it for long. The next day brought chaos. Artillery shells rained down on their position, shaking the ground and filling the air with deafening roars. Ethan barked orders, his voice cutting through the noise as he directed his unit to safety. Caleb stayed close, his rifle clutched tightly, his eyes wide but steady. Amid the pandemonium, Ethan found himself glancing back at Caleb more often than necessary. He wasn't sure if it was concern for the new recruit or something deeper, but the idea of Caleb being injured twisted his gut in a way he couldn't explain. "Stay down, Montgomery," Ethan shouted as a shell exploded dangerously close. Caleb obeyed, diving into the mud, his body pressed low. When the smoke cleared, Ethan reached out, pulling Caleb to his feet. Their eyes met briefly, the fear and adrenaline in Caleb's gaze mirroring Ethan's own. That night, the unit regrouped. The men were exhausted, their faces gaunt and smeared with dirt. Ethan and Caleb found themselves sitting side by side again, their shoulders brushing as they leaned against the trench wall. "Thanks for looking out for me today," Caleb said quietly. His voice was low, almost hesitant, but there was a sincerity in his tone that made Ethan pause. "Just doing my job," Ethan replied, though his chest tightened at the gratitude in Caleb's eyes. "You held your own out there. You're tougher than you look." Caleb smiled, a small fleeting thing that caught Ethan off guard. For a moment, the horrors of war seemed to fade, replaced by the warmth of that expression. As the night wore on, they talked again, this time delving deeper into their pasts. Caleb spoke about his childhood on a farm in Kansas, his dreams of becoming an architect, and the brother he'd lost to the same war they now fought. Ethan shared fragments of his own story. A broken family, a desire to prove himself, and the ache of a life left behind. "It's strange, isn't it?" Caleb said after a long pause. "How in all this madness, you can still find something good." Ethan looked at him, his chest tightening again. "Yeah," he said softly. "It is." In the quiet moments that followed, their connection deepened, unspoken but undeniable. Ethan felt the weight of it pressing against his ribs, a mix of fear and exhilaration. He knew what it meant to care about someone in a place like this, how dangerous it could be. But as Caleb's head tilted back, his face illuminated by the faint moonlight, Ethan realized it was already too late. Their bond was growing, fragile yet unbreakable. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt alive. But he also knew that in a world like this, love could be the greatest risk of all. Days turned into weeks, and the war showed no mercy. Ethan and Caleb moved as one in every skirmish, their unspoken bond becoming an anchor in the chaos. Though the battlefield demanded focus and discipline, they found moments of quiet solace between the thunder of gunfire. It was during one of these moments, late at night, that Caleb approached Ethan at the edge of the trench. The other soldiers were asleep, their snores and murmurs blending with the distant sounds of explosions. Caleb sat down next to Ethan, close enough that their knees touched. "Ethan," Caleb began, his voice barely above a whisper, "do you ever think about what you'd be doing if none of this had happened?" Ethan turned to him, surprised by the question. He hesitated, the weight of the war pressing heavily on his chest. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But it feels pointless. Like there's no going back to who I was before all this." Caleb nodded, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon. "I think about it all the time. What it would be like to just..." He stopped, his words hanging in the air. "To just feel normal. To not have to hide." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He knew what Caleb meant, but the risk of acknowledging it was enormous. Still, something in Caleb's voice, vulnerable, yearning, made Ethan speak. "You don't have to hide from me," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. Caleb turned to him then, his eyes wide with surprise and something else, hope. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken truths. Slowly, Caleb reached out, his hand brushing against Ethan's. The touch was fleeting, hesitant, but it sent a jolt through Ethan's entire body. For a moment, everything else faded. The war, the danger, the impossibility of their connection. It was just the two of them, suspended in a fragile bubble of intimacy. Ethan knew the risks, knew what it would mean if anyone saw them. But in that moment he didn't care. "Ethan," Caleb's voice broke the silence, trembling with emotion. "I've never felt this way before. About anyone." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Me neither," he admitted, his voice barely audible. The words hung between them, a quiet confession that changed everything. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Caleb leaned closer. Ethan's breath caught as their faces drew near, and then, finally, their lips met. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if both men were afraid it might shatter the fragile connection they had built. But as the seconds stretched, it deepened, their hands finding each other in the darkness. When they finally pulled apart, both men were breathless, their hearts pounding in unison. "We can't let anyone find out," Ethan said, his voice firm despite the warmth in his gaze. "It's too dangerous." "I know," Caleb replied, his fingers still entwined with Ethan's. "But I don't regret it, not for a second." In that moment, they both understood the cost of what they had just done. The war was unforgiving, and love was a luxury they could barely afford. But neither man could deny the truth, they had found something worth fighting for, even in the face of certain danger. The days that followed were a delicate dance of stolen glances and quiet moments in the shadows. Ethan and Caleb knew the risks, they had seen men court-martialed and worse for lesser offenses. Yet, they couldn't stop the pull between them, a magnetic force that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. During a supply run, the two found themselves momentarily alone in the woods, away from prying eyes. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches shielding the men from the relentless gaze of the world. Caleb leaned against a tree, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder, and watched Ethan with a soft smile. "Do you ever wonder what people would think if they knew about us?" Caleb asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. Ethan paused, his gaze meeting Caleb's. "I try not to think about it," he admitted. "It's easier that way." Caleb stepped closer, his boots crunching softly on the forest floor. "You're good at that, aren't you? Keeping everything buried." Ethan's jaw tightened. Caleb had a way of seeing through him, peeling back the layers he worked so hard to keep intact. "You have to be in a place like this," Ethan said. "You know that." "But it doesn't mean you don't feel it," Caleb replied, his voice dropping to a whisper. Ethan looked away, his heart pounding. Caleb was right, he felt everything. The weight of the war, the fear of losing Caleb, the intensity of their forbidden connection. It was all there, threatening to consume him. Caleb reached out, his fingers brushing against Ethan's arm. The touch was brief but grounding, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, they had each other. "We'll be okay," Caleb said softly, as if saying it aloud might make it true. Ethan nodded, though doubt gnawed at the edges of his resolve. "We have to be." As they made their way back to camp, the weight of their secret felt heavier than ever. Every step brought them closer to the others, to the reality that their love had no place in this brutal world. That night, as the men sat around the fire sharing stories and laughter, Ethan and Caleb remained silent. Their eyes met across the flames, a fleeting connection that spoke volumes. In the light of the fire, Caleb's face was soft, almost serene, and Ethan couldn't help but wonder how long they could keep this up. The thought was interrupted when a sergeant barked orders for a patrol. Ethan and Caleb were assigned together, a stroke of luck that neither acknowledged aloud. As they moved through the darkened terrain, their steps quiet and deliberate, Ethan felt a sense of calm settle over him. "Ethan," Caleb whispered, his voice breaking the silence. "If something happens." "Don't," Ethan cut him off sharply, his voice low. "Don't say it." Caleb hesitated, then nodded. But the unspoken words hung between them, a grim reminder of the fragility of their situation. In this world, nothing was guaranteed, not safety, not survival, and certainly not love. As the night stretched on, the two men walked side by side, their rifles at the ready. The tension in the air was palpable, a constant reminder of the danger they faced. But even in the heart of the war, their connection remained unbroken, a quiet defiance against the darkness surrounding them. The night was eerily quiet, broken only by the distant echoes of gunfire. Ethan and Caleb had been on patrol for hours, their movements cautious as they scanned the dark landscape for threats. The tension between them was palpable. Not from fear of the enemy, but from the unspoken truths that lingered in every glance and touch. They reached an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of a decimated village. The structure stood like a ghost of its former self, its walls charred and crumbling. Ethan signaled for Caleb to follow as he pushed open the creaking door. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ash and decay. "We'll rest here," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and began inspecting the room. Caleb followed suit, his eyes darting around the shadows. After ensuring the area was secure, they set up a makeshift camp. The silence between them grew heavier, punctuated only by the occasional shuffle of gear. Finally, Caleb broke it. "You're different out here," he said, his voice soft but probing. "You're always in control, always thinking ahead. Do you ever let yourself just be?" Ethan glanced at him, his expression guarded. "Out here, letting your guard down can get you killed," he replied. "That's not what I meant," Caleb said, stepping closer. His blue eyes searched Ethan's face, his tone carrying a weight that made Ethan's chest tighten. Ethan took a deep breath, his gaze dropping to the floor. "What do you want me to say, Caleb? That I'm scared? That every time I look at you, I'm terrified someone will see us?" Caleb's expression softened, and he reached out, his hand brushing against Ethan's. "I'm scared too," he admitted. "But I'm not scared of what they'll think. I'm scared of losing you." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He had spent so long burying his emotions, pushing them aside in the name of survival, that hearing Caleb speak them aloud felt almost unbearable. "I don't know how to do this," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "I don't know how to be with you and still be a soldier." "You don't have to know," Caleb said, stepping closer until their faces were mere inches apart. "We don't have to figure it out right now, we just have to survive, together." Ethan's resolve crumbled. Before he could second-guess himself, he closed the distance between them, his lips capturing Caleb's in a desperate, fiery kiss. It was unlike the quiet kiss they had shared before. This was raw, urgent, filled with all the things they couldn't say. Caleb responded with equal fervor, his hands gripping Ethan's jacket as if anchoring himself to the moment. For a brief, stolen second, the world outside ceased to exist. There was no war, no danger, no judgment, just the two of them, clinging to each other like lifelines. When they finally pulled apart, both men were breathless, their foreheads resting together. "I don't care what happens out there," Caleb said, his voice trembling but resolute. "This is real, Ethan, you and me. And whatever time we have, I'm not wasting it." Ethan nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Me neither," he said, his voice barely audible. The moment was interrupted by the distant sound of footsteps. Both men froze, their instincts kicking in. They quickly grabbed their rifles, their movements synchronized as they prepared for whatever, or whoever, was approaching. Ethan placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder, their eyes locking for a split second. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. As the footsteps drew closer, Ethan's grip on his rifle tightened. The love they had found in the midst of chaos was a fragile, fleeting thing, and the world seemed determined to tear it apart. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough. The footsteps grew louder, crunching through the debris outside the farmhouse. Ethan and Caleb crouched low behind a shattered table, their rifles poised. The air between them was charged, not just with the tension of impending danger, but with the unspoken promise they had just made to one another. A shadow passed by the doorway. Ethan held his breath, his finger hovering over the trigger. He felt Caleb's presence beside him, steady and unwavering, a silent reassurance. The door creaked open, revealing a fellow soldier from their unit, Private Mitchell, his face pale and his breath labored. "Blake, Montgomery," Mitchell gasped, his eyes darting between them. "Command needs us back at the trench. Enemy forces are mobilizing." "It's bad." Relief and dread washed over Ethan in equal measure. He nodded, signaling Caleb to gather their gear. Without a word, the three of them set off into the night, the urgency of the situation leaving no room for hesitation. When they returned to the trench, chaos reigned. Soldiers scrambled to reinforce their defenses as explosions lit up the distant horizon. The commanding officer barked orders, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. "Blake, Montgomery," the officer shouted. "Take point on the west flank. We're expecting a push from that direction." Ethan's stomach twisted. The west flank was notoriously vulnerable, but there was no room for argument. He exchanged a quick glance with Caleb, their silent understanding once again grounding them. As they moved into position, the first wave of enemy fire hit. Bullets tore through the air and the ground shook beneath them. Ethan barked commands to the soldiers around him, his voice steady despite the chaos. Caleb stayed close, his movements precise and efficient. But every time Ethan glanced at him, a surge of fear gripped his chest. The thought of losing Caleb was unbearable, a shadow that loomed over every decision he made. Hours passed, each moment blending into the next in a haze of gunfire and screams. The west flank held, but just barely. By the time the enemy forces retreated, the trench was littered with casualties, and the surviving soldiers were battered and exhausted. Ethan leaned against the trench wall, his body aching and his mind numb. Caleb appeared beside him, his face streaked with dirt but his eyes sharp. "You okay?" Caleb asked, his voice low but firm. Ethan nodded, though the weight of the battle pressed heavily on him. "Yeah, you?" Caleb managed a small smile. "Still standing." The sound of gunfire in the distance signaled another wave. Ethan's chest tightened as the reality of their situation sank in. They were outnumbered, outgunned and running out of time. "Whatever happens," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the chaos, "we're in this together." Ethan looked at him, his throat tightening. "Together," he agreed. As the next wave of enemy fire hit, Ethan and Caleb stood side by side, their rifles ready. The battlefield stretched out before them, a stark reminder of the price they might have to pay. But even in the face of certain danger, their bond remained unbroken. A fragile flame burning brightly in the darkness. The battle raged on through the night, each passing minute a test of endurance and will. Ethan and Caleb fought side by side, their movements seamless, as though they had been partners for years instead of weeks. The enemy's relentless push seemed endless, and the trench was soaked with the weight of sacrifice. A lull in the gunfire allowed Ethan a brief moment to breathe. He glanced at Caleb, who was reloading his rifle with practiced precision. The sight of him alive and unharmed filled Ethan with a relief so profound it almost hurt. "You're doing good, Montgomery," Ethan said, his voice barely audible over the distant sounds of war. Caleb flashed a small, tired smile. "I've got a good teacher." The moment was short-lived. An explosion shook the ground, sending debris flying into the trench. Ethan instinctively shielded Caleb, pulling him down as shrapnel whizzed overhead. When the dust settled, they both rose, coughing and disoriented. "We've got to hold this line," Ethan shouted, his voice hoarse. They returned fire, their focus unyielding, but the enemy was relentless. The west flank was collapsing, and reinforcements were nowhere in sight. Ethan's heart pounded as he realized the gravity of their situation. "We're being overrun," one of the soldiers yelled, panic lacing his voice. "Fall back to the second trench," Ethan ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos. The soldiers scrambled to retreat, but as Ethan turned to ensure Caleb was following, he saw him frozen in place, his gaze fixed on an enemy soldier taking aim. "Caleb!" Ethan screamed, his voice breaking. Time seemed to slow as Ethan lunged forward, tackling Caleb to the ground just as the shot rang out. Pain tore through Ethan's shoulder, but he barely registered it. His only focus was on Caleb, who lay beneath him, wide-eyed and unharmed. "You okay?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with pain. Caleb nodded, his face pale. "You're hit." "It's nothing," Ethan lied, pulling Caleb to his feet. "We've got to move." The retreat was chaotic, but they managed to reach the second trench. Ethan's shoulder throbbed, but he pushed the pain aside. Caleb stayed close, his concern evident, but there was no time for words. When they reached a temporary reprieve, Caleb grabbed Ethan's arm, his grip firm. "You should have let me take the hit," he said, his voice trembling with anger and something deeper. I couldn't, Ethan said simply, his eyes locking with Caleb's. The intensity of his words left Caleb speechless. For a moment, the world around them faded, and it was just the two of them in the eye of the storm. But the enemy's relentless assault shattered the moment. The second trench began to buckle under the pressure, and Ethan knew their time was running out. We hold this line, he said, his voice firm despite the despair gnawing at the edges of his resolve. Caleb nodded, his determination matching Ethan's. Together. As they prepared for the next wave, Ethan glanced at Caleb one last time, committing his face to memory. No matter what happened, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he would fight for Caleb until his last breath. The next wave came like a storm, a brutal onslaught of fire and chaos that consumed the trench. Ethan and Caleb fought side by side, their rifles blazing as the enemy advanced. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic tang of blood. Every second felt like an eternity, the world reduced to the deafening roar of battle. Ethan's shoulder burned with pain, but he refused to falter. His only focus was Caleb, whose movements were swift and precise, his face set with grim determination. Every time Ethan glanced at him, a flicker of hope sparked in his chest, even as the battle pushed them to their limits. Suddenly, an explosion ripped through the trench, sending both men flying. Ethan hit the ground hard, his ears ringing and his vision blurred. He struggled to his feet, his body screaming in protest, and frantically searched for Caleb. "Caleb!" he shouted, his voice raw with panic. He found Caleb a few feet away, lying motionless amid the rubble. Ethan's heart seized as he stumbled toward him, dropping to his knees at Caleb's side. "Caleb, talk to me," Ethan pleaded, his hands trembling as he checked for injuries. Caleb groaned, his eyes fluttering open. I'm okay," he muttered, his voice weak but alive. Relief flooded through Ethan, but it was short-lived. A second explosion tore through the trench, and this time, Ethan saw the enemy advancing in the chaos. Without thinking, he grabbed Caleb's arm and hauled him to his feet. "We've got to move," Ethan yelled, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. Caleb nodded, leaning heavily on Ethan as they stumbled toward the back of the trench. But before they could make it, a sharp crack echoed through the air. Ethan turned just in time to see Caleb jerk forward, a dark stain blooming on his chest. "No," Ethan screamed, catching Caleb as he collapsed. He lowered Caleb gently to the ground, his hands pressed against the wound in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me, Caleb," Ethan begged, his voice breaking. "You're going to be fine. You hear me?" Caleb's eyes met Ethan's, filled with pain but also something softer, acceptance. "Ethan," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's okay." "No, it's not," Ethan said, his tears falling freely now. "You don't get to leave me. Not like this?" Caleb's hand reached up, weakly brushing against Ethan's cheek. You were the best thing that ever happened to me," he whispered. Ethan shook his head, his chest heaving with sobs. "Don't say that. You're going to make it. We're going to make it." Caleb's lips curled into a faint smile. "I love you, Ethan," he said, his voice fading. "I love you too." Ethan choked out, his words barely coherent through his tears. Caleb's hand slipped from Ethan's cheek, falling limply to the ground. His eyes closed, and his chest stilled. Ethan's scream of anguish cut through the air, raw and primal. He cradled Caleb's lifeless body, his tears mingling with the blood-soaked earth. Around him, the battle continued, but for Ethan, the world had gone silent. Caleb was gone, and with him, the fragile hope that had kept Ethan alive in the darkest moments of the war. The battlefield grew quiet as the enemy forces retreated, leaving behind a grim tableau of devastation. Ethan sat motionless in the trench, cradling Caleb's lifeless body. His face was streaked with blood and tears, his mind a chaotic storm of grief and disbelief. Around him, the surviving soldiers moved like ghosts, too numbed by their own losses to notice Ethan's silent vigil. Time lost meaning. Ethan didn't know how long he stayed there, holding Caleb as though he could somehow bring him back. The weight of Caleb's final words pressed heavily on his chest. "You were the best thing that ever happened to me." Finally, a hand on his shoulder startled him. It was Private Mitchell, his face drawn and weary. "Blake," Mitchell said softly, his voice heavy with sorrow. "We have to move. Command's pulling us back." Ethan nodded numbly, his movements mechanical as he gently laid Caleb down. His trembling hand brushed a strand of blonde hair from Caleb's face, and for a moment, he allowed himself to memorize every detail, the curve of his jaw, the soft lines of his lips, the serenity that had replaced the pain. "I'll come back for you," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. "I swear." The retreat was a blur. Ethan moved through it in a daze, his mind replaying every moment he had shared with Caleb, their stolen kisses, their quiet conversations, the way Caleb's laughter had briefly chased away the horrors of war. Each memory was a knife twisting in his chest, but he clung to them fiercely, unwilling to let go. When the unit finally reached a temporary camp, Ethan collapsed onto the cold ground, his body shaking with exhaustion and grief. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't respond to the offers of food or medical attention. His world had narrowed to a singular, crushing truth. Caleb was gone. Days passed. The war continued its relentless march, but Ethan was a shadow of himself. He went through the motions of a soldier, but his heart wasn't in it. Every battle felt hollow, every victory meaningless. One evening, as the unit prepared for yet another assault, Ethan sat alone at the edge of the camp, staring at the horizon. In his hand, he held a small, battered photo of Caleb, one he had secretly taken from Caleb's belongings. It was a picture of Caleb on the farm he had spoken about so often, his smile bright and unguarded. "I should have told you more," Ethan said aloud, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have told you how much you meant to me, how much I—" He trailed off, his words swallowed by the night. But as the tears fell, he felt something stir within him, a fragile determination. Caleb's death had taken everything from him, but it hadn't extinguished the love they had shared. That love was still a part of him, a spark that refused to die. The next day, Ethan fought with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't fighting for medals or glory, he was fighting for Caleb, for the life they had dreamed of but never had the chance to live. When the war finally ended months later, Ethan kept his promise. He returned to the battlefield where Caleb had fallen, searching until he found the spot where he had held Caleb for the last time. There, he knelt in the dirt, placing a small wooden marker etched with Caleb's name. "I love you," Ethan whispered, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "And I'll carry you with me, always." As he rose to leave, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves around him. For a moment, it felt as though Caleb was there, a quiet presence beside him. Ethan closed his eyes, letting the sensation wash over him before turning and walking away. Caleb was gone, but their love remained, a beacon of light in the darkness that would guide Ethan for the rest of his life.